Hello everyone, today we talk about the Burgundian State and the Swiss Confederacy and their two different destinies, right? Quite different were also their political and social nature, in many ways, as we will see. So we have already encountered these polities in other videos here and there. We never talked maybe too much on it. Today we talk essentially about the 14th to 15th century, and the Duchy of Burgundy had a previous history, even the Swiss Confederacy, technically, and even what existed before in the causes of its rise. And we will talk about them more in detail in the future. Today we really compare them, right? And we observe in their proximity and in the intertwinement of their existence, let's say, how they, and why also possibly the outcome was the one that we already know, right? And the Duchy of Burgundy was born in 1363, in the moment, as we've seen recently in the videos about the 100 Years' War, of greatest disgregation of the French kingdom, right? When King John II had granted to his son Philip the Bold, 1363-1404, that florid land of the, can say, southeast of France in Apanache. And as we've seen, this was a moment of great strife. The Saint John II was prisoner of the English. At that point, still negotiated for the French internal affairs after his capture, the Battle of Poitiers. These are exactly the years in which the French vassals, including, as we've seen, most of them were literally other Capetian branches, and the Burgundians were fundamentally the same. At this point, the Valois were on the throne, but that's were also another Capetian branch. And what we follow in the lineage from Philip the Bold to Charles the Bold is properly the Valois Burgundy house, that we call it like this, because of course their most important appanage was the Duchy of Burgundy, but extended also beyond, and that's why we call it, by the way, the Burgundian State altogether, as we will see at this quite complex territorial composition, because it was, we cannot essentially give a name to this system that has of powers that was essentially a sum of possessions of different, very heterogeneous nature. In this case, that stretched across the French and the imperial border. This area that was also very advanced and in many ways, and albeit also diversified. And so through the House of Burgundy had a dramatic success in this, because they exploited essentially the same French weakness, right? Which is paradoxical, because they were the same royal house, basically, right? Just settled in as a cadet branch in the Dutch, and so this wouldn't prevent them to pursue, in fact, an autonomous policy that was also kind of rolling backwards relatively to the attempt of political recomposition of the Kingdom of France during the struggle against the English. And this was naturally because of the benefit would derive from the lack, let's say, of a superior authority in this autonomous expansion of the Valois Burgundy in areas that were at that point, in fact, quite fragmented in France for this reason, in the Holy Roman Empire, because it was the Holy Roman Empire, and chronically, fragmented, and because in this way, basically, they could literally build one of the most successful powers in late medieval Europe. There is no doubt of this, and this was carried out through a policy of literally purchasing and marriages. Essentially, Philip the Bold and his son John the Fearless had constituted an heterogeneous but rich group of cities, of lands that, beyond Burgundy itself, encompassed the Franche-Comté, Flanders, Hainaut, Holland, Brabant, Namur, and Luxembourg. These were all lands that had historically remained fundamentally, let's say, frontier, we could say, since the initial partition of the Carolingian Empire. Some of these fell, in fact, within the French orbit, others on the namely German one. But they were also kind of autonomous in nature, right? Most of these places actually spoke French, Flemish, right? They were not properly even within the empire properly German. That's because the western frontier of the empire had always remained kind of blurred in a sense. Think about the same ambiguities with Flanders in itself, that in part was imperial, in part was French. This was also a matter of how literally the feudal mechanisms and titling and institutional development had really worked. And these places, however, had already by themselves exploited their autonomy. The fact that they were developing in areas where there was no major centralizing power that could kind of impose a strong policy on them. The same Flanders, as we've seen, had been subjugated by the French after the revolt at the beginning of the 14th century, but never quite been fully controlled, and that had also brought to the same rise of the 100 Years' War. And part of the reason because the Burgundians could also expand in Flanders was because they were essentially backing the Flemish autonomism, of course, but also there had been an English support to the same Flanders to be autonomous from the French. So even though the same Burgundians at some point entered in contrast with the English, because they wanted to control at that point Flanders more than probably the English wanted, in turn, still, as long as the Armagnac and the Burgundian party in France were opposed, and the Valois, the kings of France, were still a threat for the English. Of course, generally speaking, there was this axis between England and Burgundy that continued later on, also after the French won the war, and they, as we will see, find themselves with this parallel state just east of Paris that was also interfering in the English affairs during for example, the Wars of the Roses, right? The Burgundians had backed the York, the French, the Lancaster. The Burgundians were French, however, if here I'm just differentiating for the sake of allegiance in a way, but they were essentially French power. There's no doubt about this. Also because the feudal core of their power, the core of their power was feudal in nature, right? Burgundy was one of the most radically, French, countries in culture, even though it had managed always to maintain this autonomy, had modernized fast because internally there was also a process of state building. We made this of a concentration of power that it had even skipped the split of in the various cadet branches in order to maintain a unity of the inheritance. So it was a very successful state, very rich, very productive, very fertile, right? This we explained in the video we made about the Duchy of Burgundy in the just exactly before this time, before the 14th century. And the following two dukes of Burgundy, that is Philip the Good and Charles the Bold, so respectively 1419, 1467, and 1467, 1477, had added to the aforementioned territories also High Alsace, the Duchy of Gelderland, and one of Lorraine, right? That were all still basically in the same areas of, fringe areas, let's say. And in fact, these lands were essentially in part French, in part Germanic, and thus in part formally dependent on the French king, and in part on the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, it was all a policy of interference that the Burgundians, from their their standpoint, had respectively in these policies, even participating to even aiming respectively at the rule of France or the rule, at least in a way at some point, English allowing certain, with certain limits, but also even to the election to the Holy Roman Imperial title. And these lands were, part were characterized by flowering agriculture. Other were distinguished by the presence of great manufacturing, commercial, and portual centers, such as Bruges and Antwerpen, that were also, especially the what would become later the Netherlands proper in the north, were rising in importance compared to the southern ones. Bruges was still very prestigious, and they were thriving centers also because of northern traffics in the North Sea, and with the Hanse and all. And so there was a very varied combination of communities, right, in nature. Because, again, the continental lands were mostly feudal, fundamentally, very rich, very aristocratic in nature, this sense, very powerful lordships. And in the north, in the Netherlands, you had essentially free communes, or at least autonomous communes, that were some of the most advanced places, essentially in Europe at that point, and making a lot of money with banking, very technologically advanced. Burgundy was able to was essentially the first country in Europe to develop a kind of a modern artillery park, right? Even before the French, the Kingdom of France itself, thanks to the the working, the skills, the manufacturing, the technologies of the Flemish cities. So Burgundy, by the late 20th century, so at the apex of its power, presented itself as a sort of federal state that stretched from the Alps up to the North Sea, right? So this lands that had traditionally been, the only polity that had somewhat overlapped, even though very differently in derivation, was the Lotharingia, after this kind of third state between France and Germany that had never, however, had a consistency on its own. It's part of the reason, in a sense, why no power had unified these territories before, and essentially was this French offspring that managed to do it at this point in history. And this area altogether was arguably the richest and most active in Europe at the time, right? This may seem paradoxical, but it's really not, because the autonomy had brought these centers in a sense to exploit all the upheavals, especially in these turmoilous times, right? In the crisis of the 14th century, the contraction of the big monarchies, right? Especially of France. Think about for Flanders that had, the French had tried to conquer. The same, machinations that were occurring in Germany, if you want, had brought these centers to put themselves a bit as a crossroad and to profit, importantly, and also from a commercial point of view. And the Burgundian court was essentially the most splendid in Europe, right? There is an obvious, this is renowned, right? The Burgundians were all one with chivalric values. Think about the Golden Fleece. They were the embodiment of 15th century European chivalry, right? And as such, they had also been recognized by the other Europeans at some point. Think about the great expeditions at Nicopolis. Probably, would you entrust a Crusader army to the Dukes of Burgundy, right? Because they know better. They are true men of war. They're true knights. They are powerful. They're rich. They are imbued of this, fanatic sense of honor, of grandeur, of loyalty that was typical, of course, of the feudal values at the time. The French had somewhat always topped the scale of European standards in that sense. So and they were also very effective administrators. They displayed an extraordinary pragmatic capacity. They knew how to favor the mercantile classes, the entrepreneurial ones, but especially of the cities, right? Not that they ever came less to, they came to like as noblemen the commerce per se, but they realized that those were thriving centers. They had to cope with, right? There was always a negotiation, and nothing was ever like so heavenly in nature in the practice of government. But we can say, right, that in no 15th century state the prince got such a more extended, deep, and unanimous consensus such than in Burgundy, right? The noblemen loved their duke as the first knight of the duchy and protector of the feudal customs. The merchants were, they appreciated much the intelligent promotion of trade and manufacturing activities, and even the inferior classes venerated the duke as a generous benefactor that was always ready to spend, to display power, wealth, all these great tournaments, even just in terms of entertainment. And this naturally was possible thanks to the great economical situation of the Dutch, right? And you can argue in a way that there were some mechanisms that are interesting. We will see more in detail when observing this state, because it actually lacked a political and institutional uniformity, and there were still some attritions, of course. Even the militaristic policy that Burgundy undertook towards the end brought to disaster at the end of the day. All these great failures, from one side, shows the power, the prestige, even the consensus in which, of course, the dukes could levy their army. But at the same time, there's this big question mark that has been pointed out, obviously, right, considering also the end of the duchy and how it was fundamentally, it was a polity that, as it rose, it fundamentally crumbled, right? And so when you find these entities in history, you must give them, of course, that things might have gone differently, as always. Some want to stress too much the fact that the Burgundian army was, for example, against the Swiss, was kind of backwards or, magnificent but useless, because, the future was towards, the Swiss model. But if you study that from a strictly strategical point of view, you look at the campaigns and the battles, you perfectly understand that things could have gone differently. And today we are kind of sowing this cloth, right? Some degree of determinism to explain why that happened in the first place. It's not quite so, but politically speaking, right? Of course, you must give an answer to the question. And indeed, that heterogeneity of all these territories probably didn't favor very much the development of something that could be equated to states of much greater national monarchic tradition, for example, such as the same France, right? That was literally at some point taken over by the English and by the same Burgundians, and managed to strike back and to defeat both, and to essentially dissolve Burgundy and incorporate in it, and going on as the French state that it had concretely been in a more central way. So all this wealth and happiness naturally conceals the fact that even the degree of control that the dukes could have on these territories was relatively limited, right? And that I don't know, you can't make literally cooperate exactly in the same way the radically aristocratic fiefs of Central Europe and the Flemish autonomous communes, right? There is a contribution that, of course, they can bring both, but in terms of political cohesion, this thing didn't have there was really no place, let's say, where the Burgundians could say, well, we can organize a last stand because there is a core land, after all, that belongs really to us. Even the same Burgundy, after all these mechanisms had been entangled, had been unavoidably part of the Kingdom of France itself. It would a renewed French power would have, in a sense, always re-encompassed that unity as something on its own, not like a different country. Which, as we will see, is an important distinction that we can make with Switzerland, that started from actually a worse standpoint and yet managed to carve itself up, an independent place in Europe, displaying an important force and a great moral strength, and a rhyming tale to our days. In a reality that objectively didn't even have, even in there, much of a historical previous unity or coherence. If you would just talk about some pregressed political or social sense of belonging, but per se, as it came to be formed, right? So naturally, everything was developed along the way and exploiting those contingencies and so on. And we must also give this, that a very rich land like Burgundy, a very powerful one, also from a military point of view, and in fact one that was built on such heterogeneous basis, was looked upon with suspicion and legitimately by its own neighbors. Right, Philip the Good and Charles the Bold didn't make any mystery of their political ambitions. They intrigued with France, England, the Empire, Papal Rome. So Philip the Good dreamed, for example, to organize a crusade for the liberation of Constantinople. At that point, had already fallen to the Ottomans, so that he could have essentially acquired, could have been crowned as emperor in the East. And Charles the Bold intended, so these are Burgundy's same power participated in the battle to the campaign of Nicopolis, the one of Varna. So again, this were essentially the Westerners organizing expeditions there, even to cope internationally with the Ottoman expansion. And even in there, things could have gone differently, right? The rise of the Ottomans doesn't have to be given for granted either, right? And Charles the Bold intended, even presenting himself as candidate to the German princes electors for the crown of King of Germany and sovereign of the Holy Roman Empire. Think about the siege of Neuss, failed even in there, this great display of Burgundian magnificence, but at the same time, still kind of a difficulty of a system that by friction slowed down, didn't quite make it to be so punching and impacting as instead other German powers would be. That's why we'll talk about the Swiss Confederacy, but even the same Habsburgs, right, at that point were the ones that fundamentally profited from this, that initially were kind of suspicious themselves towards the Burgundians, eventually inheriting their own legacy essentially by matrimonial power, but at least in the Flanders, in the Netherlands, but the not really liking very much these newcomers that were so close to the Rhine Valley, to the powerful ecclesiastical electorates, and to some of the richest areas of Germany. They were also threatening the Swiss Confederacy. So essentially filling a gap that at that point, if the Burgundians had succeeded, would have really made them an imposing power, superpower, right, by European standards, and who knows what would have happened at that point. So this brought, as always, when too much power is displayed, to the Burgundian enemies to coalesce, right? This was a very wide front. So against Charles the Bold, and so when France had also recompacted its own power, came to descend in the field the King of France, the Emperor, the Swiss cantons, that they felt threatened by Charles' will of conquest. So this is important because you see there is the consolidation of other powers in the meanwhile. In a sense, all powers that are created so relatively rapidly in a vacuum, because of the weakness of certain other polities like France or the Empire. Eventually, as soon as those powers reacquire capacity, and they have to cope with the fact that they fundamentally expanded in a vacuum, not in a place that, as we were saying before, had a pre-existing statal tradition. Of course, the Burgundians were quite good at building this all. It took time. It was a gradual process, but at the same time, it was just more adding, right? Kind of collectioning all the various, communities around, a bit through blackmail, a bit through other, pressure, a bit like, by matrimonial policy, in this sense of a good degree of chance as well. So it used to be that this is well explained in a video we've made also about the Duchy of Burgundy, as it had already before John II kind of acquired important prerogatives over even the same Netherlands by marriage ties and so on. And these were floating things, right? It could go otherwise. There was a point in which the Duke of Burgundy could have already taken the whole Netherlands and more, even at an earlier date, right? So these mechanisms do not speak for a great degree of stability of the whole system. So, as you know, and we will make videos about this, we made some video about the Swiss recently, but Charles the Bold was repeatedly defeated, right, battle after battle, at the hand especially of the Swiss and their new infantry type, based on these massive blocks of heavily drilled pikemen that essentially up to the 15th century had never existed in medieval Europe. They were also very different from the Swiss armies of the previous generations. And famously enough, the Saint Charles the Bold lost his life at the siege of Nancy, at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, and pretty sad, dramatic story. The guy was found, basically a half, eaten by wolves, left on the battlefield. This ruinous catastrophe, right, that brought an end properly to the Burgundian main line. So, and even just think from a moral point of view what this meant. As we've seen, there was this huge effort, and because you see the state communities had supported this policy because they wanted, in a sense, to keep enjoying that kind of autonomy that, after all, the same existence within the Burgundian state had enjoyed them, but it had made them enjoy. But it was also a great cost, right? Grandson, Murat, Nancy, all these massive defeats costed an astonishing amount of money to the world state, and the fact that not just this came as repeated defeats, but properly also to the end of the dynasty, because it literally was cut biologically mainline on the battlefield. Well, that made the dual system collapse, right? So if there had been any other kind of unity of some sort, this didn't actually, wasn't showed up right afterwards. So this Burgundian Federation fragmented after Charles' death with the Treaty of Arras in 1483. The countries that already belonged to the Duchy of Burgundy, properly to the French part, passed to the French King Louis XI, 1461-1483, and in part, however, to Mary of Burgundy, who was the prestigious heiress, daughter of Charles the Bold himself. And as Mary had married through this, one of the single most important unions in European history, with Maximilian of Habsburg, right? So Holy Roman Emperor, this House of Habsburg that at this point was rising as the greatest power in Germany, with great ambitions, and that together with this alliance and eventually also the marriage of Maximilian and Mary, Philip the Good, with the Spanish Infanta, Jeanne, the Loca, as she's called in Spanish, because of of her very likely mental issues. That, however, she was the daughter of the Catholic kings, right? That had united Spain dynastically, at least Castile and Aragon. So this would bring, given that Joanna was the last heiress, was the heiress of the two kingdoms, the Habsburgs rose to this, up to that point, relatively modest, well placed, especially since the time of Frederick III, southeastern German power that had managed to sum up important possessions in Central Europe and through dynastic ties, etc., but still remaining somewhat limited, especially with what that fixed that Germany was to expand, and it was very difficult to inherit. To sum up, the crowns that we know eventually will be all, in fact, that essentially the ones of the Empire was already of the House of Habsburg in Central Europe, plus the what we call the Burgundian Legacy, that was all but Burgundian in that sense, was Netherlandish, right? Was Flemish. Of, in fact, the Netherlands, Spain. So this enormous landmass that through the dynastic union had now could rivalry with France, that also owned all its Mediterranean possessions, the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily, Naples, right? So an enormous amount. So that projected the Habsburgs as formally the most powerful of the European dynasties, albeit these possessions, of course, were not like a state, right? Either, right? They were just a sum of feudal titles that, as you know, would be also pretty difficult to maintain together, also because they were radically different cultural backgrounds. Like the Austrians and the Spanish, let's be honest, they hated each other, simply meant. And even, I don't know, the Flemish, you would think that they were closer to the Germanness, let's say, of the Habsburg, but they hated their guts, right, at that point. But importantly enough, this, as always, much of these possessions politically are kept together by hatred, meaning that now the big competitor was reunified France, that had risen from the 100 Years' War as factually the largest unitary power in Europe, and therefore all these powers essentially coalesced. The Habsburgs' possessions coalesced, right, to counter the French, and naturally nothing was ever so easy, because of course eventually the Reformation would kick in. Also in Germany, the Habsburgs were stamped, let's say, the same. There were lots of issues going on with Italy as well. Also, the English intervened, so it's really complicated, and it's just modern history. But I think we all know what we're talking about, because if you don't know that hub of European history from the 1500s, right, we really can't even call yourself properly a Westerner, for that matter. In any case, so all this started from the Burgundian State, if you want. Even, I don't know, for making you see the importance of the Burgundian legacy from a cultural point of view, the flag of Spain used during the modern age was the Saint Andrew's cross, right? That the same Spanish, albeit being so nationally proud, would essentially make their own because of the huge prestige of the house of what had been the House of Burgundy, its nobility and so on. Of course, it's an Habsburg medium, but so that you find this heraldic device also in the Americas eventually because of the Spanish Empire, all these things. So that leaves very much on in European legacy in many ways. Again, the Order of the Golden Fleece, this gold standard of chivalric values and so on. And a Burgundian taste that was eventually paraded properly also by some of the greatest rulers of the time, Charles V himself, that of all essentially his cultural, diversified cultural background from Austria to Spain, etc., fundamentally what he was as a person, also because he was rising in the Netherlands, was essentially the model of Burgundian knight, right? That was the idea. That was the way he identified himself, and also that it was his first identity, his first language, still Flemish and so on. So this is very important to understand lots of things about even modern identity and the differences that existed at the time. Properly, in a world that was still dynastic, right? States were being born in a kind of a national sense. But still, the discriminant was mostly who does rule us, right? That was the idea. It's not what state am I in a kind of a sovereign sense, right? It's always somebody ruling us, right? We are free as a people, but we decide to swear allegiance to that ruler, right? And about this, I would like to add, however, that the Netherlands, especially throughout the Burgundian domination, gave, let's say, had acquired through the administrative institutional reforms of the Valois, Burgundy, etc., a level of homogeneity that they hadn't quite enjoyed, particularly before, and that had spurred a sense of, in this homogeneous sense of national identity rising, right? In a way, and this, in fact, it was also difficult for the Habsburgs to install themselves there. The Habsburgs tried also a military reform in Flanders. Think about the Battle of Guinegate against the French, where the Habsburgs had called properly some Swiss instructors that would have to essentially replicate the Swiss reforms in the Netherlands, but those communities didn't have, the Habsburgs didn't control that communities to the adequate level of coercion and political consensus that could allow them to levy such an enormous amount of resources, right? So that the battle was even by itself a good enough. And the first Flemish victory after like 200 years, after an astonishing amount of defeats, come at the hand of the same French military culture, either through the French or the Burgundians. So that reflect even in there where modernity lays, right? Think about the Battle of Courtrai and realize that yes, it was a big deal, but there was never like kind of a qualitative, modern improvement of Flemish military culture in the following centuries by any standard, in properly in terms of strategic culture. You had to wait for the Swiss mountaineers to do that. We'll see that in a while. But going back to the French-Austrian partition, we could say, of the Burgundian state. Consider at this point, Maximilian was son of the Emperor Frederick III, and so when he married Mary, he was still simply a heir of the Dutch to the Duchy of Austria, right? So he was not emperor yet, right? It was still something done on, say, mostly from And this partition contemplated that two fronts would have gone: Picardy, Burgundy itself, the county of Nevers. So essentially all lands that are French, in fact, still, and would remain, in fact, under the French state. For good. And while the important Burgundian legacy, constituted by Artois, the Netherlands, Limburg, the French Comte, Luxembourg, would have gone to the Habsburgs, essentially, albeit the French king boasted rights on the Artois and on the French Comte, and in fact he would essentially expand in there. But interestingly enough, the Habsburgs never gave up their or at least they kind of resumed later that their own rights, right, their own claims to their rights, the Burgundian legacy altogether, right? So this entailed, even ironically at the time of Francis I and Charles V, that latter was technically vassal of the French king in a way, right, albeit being whole Roman emperor and technically superior to him. But that's particularly important because those territories were always given back and forth. You know that in all the various treatises of the wars of Italy, the Habsburgs and the French always contended. In fact, the French Comte, and so in other territories at the borders between France and the Empire, that the Habsburgs said, those belong to us because we inherited them dynastically from the kings of Burgundy, Mary of whom was the legitimate heir. And yet, as we were saying before, basically nothing of a Burgundian legacy remained, because Burgundy was, in terms of political autonomy, because the duchy was absorbed by France, the Flemish were something else. So it was mostly on who ruled them, and that degree of autonomy, in a sense, would remain quite rooted, especially in the Netherlands, right? Also, all the issue with the Spanish later on, the 80 Years' War, was even there, it could be avoided, frankly, because it's not that the Netherlands hated the Spanish more than others. It's what happened. They had to gain something from it. It's about the political balance and how things were handled eventually. Different administrations, different policies that brought eventually to the rebellion that, as you know, was not even unitary, as fundamentally today the Netherlands and Belgium are two different countries, is because of that. And still it all stemmed from this, right? It all stemmed, if you want, as all in history, from pure randomness, right? Even if there is an intention there, right? The Burgundians, for some reason, may have never acquired the lowlands, and it would have been it, right? It would have been something else. There were also difficult areas to control for everybody, but because the French were always wanting to invade them, basically since the 13th century, but others would get in the way. The English during the 100 Years' War, now with this Habsburg connection, basically still the Empire and the English, yes, many campaigns fought there. That's how Flanders also turned into one of the most crowded and, let's say, hip European strategic theaters. Right, there is hardly any Flemish town that hasn't had a military history of great consistency, especially during the modern, but also the contemporary era for that matter. Think about the First World War. But in a sense, it all came from that balance. It was established at the time. So we must talk about the Swiss. I still haven't made a video about the Swiss proper altogether. We started from this year to really talk consistently about them a bit. Even if made a video about the early medieval Alemannia, in a sense, the Swabia, how that's where fundamentally Switzerland stemmed from, at least from the within. Then we made a video on the Swiss Confederacy, the Free, also the Swiss military system, and we'll keep talking about that, making all the videos on the Burgundian Swiss war battles that are very important. We talk about the Burgundian ordnance system, so we covered some of that, even in, considering that the Swiss were the main foes of the Burgundian army, that for us to test that militarily speaking. What it meant for Burgundy to be essentially defeated by this power. And the Swiss was still on the rise, in a sense, while the Burgundian experience was coming to an end. Let's say from the crisis of the Holy Roman Empire had been born during the 14th century a new federal organization that would have had this great importance in the modern world. We've already seen how important city leagues were in Germany in this post-Hohenstaufen phase, the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire, the princely Germany, and so on. So that essentially most of this southwestern lands of Germany, like essentially the Rhineland and Swabia, that were the richest, right? Southern Germany was the richest, and then also the Rhineland, because of its traffics historically, those were the productive areas, and so these were areas that, in a sense, as we've seen, partly also with Burgundy, that was just next door in the west, had been so hypertrophic economically speaking that nobody, given the collapse of German monarchic authority, they had never been ordered, like they had grown autonomously, right? And that's in a very fragmented and heterogeneous way. And cities leagues, especially, had importantly risen. It was the Rhenish League, the Swabian League, and the Swiss Confederacy kind of fits in because they were both kind of cities and other, essentially pastoral communities. Switzerland had a very kind of unique character. Historically, these communities had risen without much of a progressed political unity. This is, if you want the properly the confederal nature of Switzerland in its deep, however, properly national character. The idea that there are many free communities that join together for a common goal, and this is essentially the meaning of a nation, right? It's not much what the background is. Of course, there were similar centers, but they came in, they joined, right, in this moment of difficulty for the imperial stability, initially as a Landfried, which was essentially a political practice that had usually been the prerogative of the imperial power, right? When there was a war among the many that always existed among the German princes, the emperor said, "No, now you have to pacify the situation, otherwise we will attack you and we will." So it was essentially an important display of power, and the Swiss had initially reacted like this to such troubles. They had joined as a Landfried, right? And Friede here is meant literally in Germanic peace, but peace essentially kept up thanks to the value of arms, which is a very beautifully civilizational etymology, because it's not a random idealistic piece abstracted in, as a utopia. It's literally that, a bit like the Latin proverb "civis pacem para bellum," right? That is, there is a civilizational value in military power and its deterrence, because without that you cannot essentially create order and prosperity. And this is, there is all a strategic culture. Now, the Swiss pioneers, and still today, they're one of the countries that has the greatest, possession of personal, weapons, including light machine guns and so on. And yet, one of with the lowest rates of criminality and of gun violence, and so proving that, of course, as always, the gun is just a tool. It's not about it's always somebody using it, and you have at that point to go deeply at the culture, at the civic education, a democratic value of a people, to understand how certain employment of violence actually works, and what are the true causes of it. So naturally, the Landfried at the head of this confederacy was a political fiction, because it was a very hypocritical way of saying we are now the ones who make order. That in that mess that Germany had turned into, like it was like a bit the Far West in a way. But you gotta give that the Swiss, of course, achieved this striking result on their own. So providing again that level of pacification and function, and prosperity and so on in their own. It was, however, a long process, right? At the beginning of the Landfried, the Swiss didn't think that they would have become Switzerland, right? The concept properly did not exist. There were just German communities within the German kingdom, within the empire. Nothing else. There had already been, as we've seen, other leagues of cities, the Lombard one, the Rhenish one, the Swabian one. So in the empire, it was not really a novelty. But what we look at when we talk about Switzerland is essentially this originary term that actually takes the name only from one small area, but quite important one, the peasant one of Schwyz, from which, in fact, Swiss stems from, and that is in an area comprehended between the Alps and the Upper Rhine Valley. And the Schwyz people depended directly on the empire, of course. These were imperial subjects, right? But they were feeling threatened at that point. We're talking about the early 14th century, by the feudal power of the Habsburgs that stretched from the Upper Rhine up to Tyrol. So that's what is interesting about also the rise of the Swiss Confederacy, that technically, if you pick about the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollern, it's that these great dynastic imperial powers, that, as they would become later on, they were also originary from Switzerland. And part of the reason of this was what today we call Switzerland, and that was not overlappingly Swabia, culturally speaking. We talked about the rise of the Habsburgs recently. We've seen these were some very modest counts that had backed consistently Frederick II, getting lots of prerogatives. Eventually, Count Rudolf was elected king of the Romans and managed to secure Austria, Styria, Carinthian parts of the, also all across the Alpine arc. So Habsburgic power is the same Luxembourg one, the same even Angevin one part, has shifted towards these other Central European lands in the east that were somewhat more manageable. That, as we were saying before, the much more messed up, intertwined, kind of entrenched Western German situation, where too many forces for one of the single dynasties were, at that point, after the usurpation of imperial public rights, for them to essentially reestablish a centralized power in the area. So they preferred to move somewhere else. And so that's how the Habsburgs became Austrian, fundamentally, given that the Duchy of Austria was the most important of their possession. But they stem from these areas. And the rise of the Swiss and the rise of the Habsburgs, ironically speaking, is owed to the same Frederick II in common. Because Frederick, as you know, as he was a Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and so on, it was cared really, really much for the Alpine crossing from Germany to Italy for strategic reasons. And so he had provided this Swiss communities that were not particularly developed at the time, right? They were essentially shepherds, mountaineers, that they had, yes, already some communal development, but they weren't anything special. But because of the opening of important Alpine passage and essentially the entrusting to the Swiss of such a bridge and its passage into Italy, this community, that Frederick died, the Hohenstaufen went downhill and all this stuff. So the Swiss found themselves in control of this very important trade passages that made them become quite rich, quite fast. Even at the time, nothing extremely glamorous compared to other areas. I mean, this doesn't compare, for example, with the aforementioned lowlands or something, but still, this probably conferred to the local communities a character that, maybe not so surprisingly enough, is proper of many peoples of success. Right? You can see it among the Romans, the Franks, etc. Essentially, there are peoples who secured an enormous prestige and position in history. The same Dutch later on, maybe the Libyans during the Bronze Age. There are these peoples that manage essentially to carve themselves a place out in history from relative nothingness. And much of this is connected with a deep strategic concept that, in fact, as we were saying before, also identifies the Swiss from a political point of view in their military, etc. That is the combination of, let's say, primitive warlike virtue, we could say, and wealth, reason, development, right? So two systems that, when combined, confer essentially from one side the motivation, the moral forces, right, the moral superiority, and from the other side the means, the material means, the instruments, to create something that at that point makes a lot of sense, because these communities had a common goal. That was the one of preserving their own autonomy, as we will see now, the Habsburgs were instead ruling in Swabia at that point, and so they were the lords of the area. Didn't quite like, because they wanted also to control those lands and to essentially take back what was technically theirs, at least by feudal right. Instead, the Swiss opposed themselves to them. And there is something very primitive, actually, in Swiss culture in this sense. We talked about this, talking about, in fact, the Confederates, the Friede, is properly the idea that these were, rude, violent mountaineers, right? That in that sense had all that kind of hunger and motivation and violence, habit to that kind of mindset that would allow them to take up arms against the feudal elite, right? So much that, as you know, the original Swiss cantons in this were Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden. That eventually, these were essentially the cantons, the other areas that had risen as communes, right, in these valleys, and so on, that in 1315 joined together and crushed the Habsburg army at Morgarten. The other great battles are Laupen, Sempach in the 14th century. So these were peasants, mountaineers that repelled the feudal troops of the Habsburgs. It's very interesting to study 14th century Swiss military history, because it's not obvious, right? Among the Swiss, surely, first of all, something I care very much about, that I told in so many different occasions, because I specialize in early 14th century warfare, and in general, of course, I expand my interest, that the Swiss of the mid 15th century had, militarily speaking, basically nothing to do with the ones of the early 14th century. It's to say that the military systems were completely and deeply different. The early 14th century Swiss fit among the European populations, such as, in fact, the Flemish, the Scots, the German Dithmarscher, and so on, as this infantrymen that managed to defeat, after centuries of relegation in moral and material inferiority, the ultra elite of the world at the time, as the Habsburgs were, as the French were, and so on. And the Swiss owed a lot in this sense to their quality, but in a way they can't, among all the early 14th century infantries, they are not actually the finest, right? They were often helped by the ground, by the maneuvers, by the fact that they ambushed, for example, the Habsburg army at a point without, so that the enemy was caught by surprise, couldn't even line up, and who knows, if they could have done it, maybe they would have won at that point, so history would have gone differently. So, in a way that is relatively difficult for us to measure. Morgarten is maybe the best, we have properly some realization of even of the effectiveness of these infantries, right? The Vogue, the halberds later were used properly as cannon openers, right? And against knightly armor and so on. But still, it's important also to consider always the strategic and tactical situation, because not always there is a pure confrontation like a flatland where you have the two armies clashing and you can measure like an iron arm who is really the strongest in that term. So the Swiss, however, that was enough for them, right? They weren't doing for proving anything. They were doing it to prove a lot, of course, but not from a strictly military point of view. War is just a tool, as we know, as Clausewitzians. So what they wanted was their political independence, or still autonomy at the time, and of course they proved that on the battlefield. They proved their moral force. They proved their interest. They proved that the effectiveness of their political project. Right, and only later on they developed into something else. By the way, their interest was not much conservative in nature, but actually expansionistic, because across the Swiss valleys they began to take over an important amount of territories. I don't know, stripping them from account of Savoy. At some point they clashed against Milan. Then later on also against the Burgundians. Well, that was mostly a threat coming from the outside. But what is important here is that the Peasant League widened to other cantons, many other cantons, while the Habsburgs, the Dukes of Austria, were definitely defeated at the Battle of Sempach in 1386. And during the 15th century, the Swiss cantons had to face the expansionistic aims of the Dukes of Burgundy, as we know, but these mountaineer soldiers now of the Swiss Confederacy that had created this dramatically more advanced system of pikes, of squares of thousands of pikemen that were something again completely different from what they had ever fought like up to the mid 15th century, managed to defeat militarily the St. Dukes of Burgundy in 1477. And Swiss, as you know, would rise as sort of military standard up to the early 16th century, because nobody up to that point in medieval Europe had come up with that degree, with that tactics. You may wonder, why did this happen? Well, the Swiss at that point were a very large country after all. And they even had a consistent population. And they had a common aim. So there was enough political cohesion for them to implement the military means at their disposal, and particularly the training of their infantry. That was essentially the only thing they had. They hadn't bought in basically any other system up to that point. Because they didn't need, they had cavalry, they had starting to have inner artillery, but never developed at levels that can be useful to them. Their advantage, we made a video on Swiss tactics recently, was mostly speed, order, alignment, something that was possible only through a massively intense training that the Swiss undertook, properly deciding it in their cantons, far away, also training their troops, away from other countries' eyes, let's say, in new ways. That after the defeat at Arbedo by the Milanese, that eventually had proven that even a dismounted knight could still defeat with his lance Swiss phalanx of halberdiers. So basically, at that point they increase their ratio of pikes that eventually would become almost. It would become prevalent, right? 80% even later on. Which requires much more training than the halberd to remain in alignment, because the pike is a cumbersome thing. It has swings, etc. So the Swiss invested an enormous amount of resources to train their troops like nobody had done before, to maintain that level of cohesion that this mass of pikes could have on the battlefield, advancing, right, which was new, right? Infantry did advance on the field, but they did mostly in support up to that point to cavalry. They wouldn't venture out there all alone by themselves, right? They were always either in a defensive position, etc. The Swiss instead changed this now, because they passed on the counteroffensive, and even their tactical sophistication wasn't so high. We've seen even how, from pike fencing, that was probably quite disordered. The thing that really, that was quite, brutally, unsophisticated, let's put it in this way. But the important thing is that they had now the speed that no infantry unit ever had, because otherwise, before, they would have lost cohesion. Now, instead, they had enough training to remain cohesive, and therefore to shift this blocks of troops across the battlefields before the enemy could even understand what was going on. And so surprising them, because up to that point nobody had ever experienced that so far. Of course, there were other factors, many contingental ones as well, and the Swiss, in spite of their clamorous victories against the Burgundians and later on they they always risked, right? There was no deterministic reason for which they would have to succeed at each time, but they still did, and this naturally is attributed to this dramatic capacity of infantry. It was eventually there to stay in modern warfare, basically forever, in spite of this sinusoidal trend of cavalry that would contract and re-expand and so on. But fundamentally, this spike-only system, because there wasn't properly even a shot here yet, it was irrelevant, it was just for screening and other things, but would remain as the pike squares the standard, right, of European warfare up to essentially the mid-17th century. And so the Swiss were the first ones to open this system, and quite soon the other countries began to copy them. Also, initially the Swiss didn't have to serve abroad, but they began at some point to desert and, to do it even for free. So eventually the Swiss Confederacy in the Italian wars declined in expansionistic ambition, and it's important to stress, however, that was probably their the reason why Switzerland existed proper, because at some point the Swiss could even, take over Milan and govern from there, because it was much more advantageous, and that would have probably brought to a different Switzerland. It might have not even existed Switzerland as we intend it today, right? It would have become something else. Instead, those defeats, the fact that they were kept at bay, still brought them to remain, right, essentially in the territories we still see today, and to consolidate a position that today is mostly, as you understand, for banking, financial. It's because also the nature of the country that is very difficult to take over. At least it's always possible, but we would do that. And in fact, it wouldn't happen historically. And still, the history of the Swiss Confederacy is very complex. It was also very violent, because they kept also fighting among each other. They intervened in the German affairs, etc. But as far as we're concerned today, in 1499, there is the Peace of Basel that would have definitely sanctioned the independence of the Confederacy, and thus making it acquire up to that point, the consistency that properly from an international institutional point of view, also within the empire and so on, would have remained, right, in the centuries to come, for the country to exist as we know it, to become as we know it. And so, confronting these two powers, we see something paradoxical. That is to say, communities of peasants and mountaineers were more successful at the end of the day of a feudal state, of such the high nobiliary prestige of Burgundy, as they actually fought even on the battlefield to prove that. Consider that at the time of the Burgundian Swiss Wars, the Burgundian army was essentially the most advanced in organization after together with the Venetian Condotta. It was looked upon with marvel, just as the Burgundian State, by the other countries. There was a general, recognition that was something very advanced in the effort for uniformity of the army, its tactical specialization. And people say, oh, well, look at they simply were defeated by the Swiss. Of course, the Swiss tactical means were, if we want, more effective and simpler, so they won for this. But at the same time, we shouldn't, as we were saying before, first of all, ever underestimate the, luck, right, and bad luck, because in war you can't go anywhere without that, like in life in general, independently from your capacities. And consequently, however, to try to measure what these capacities actually were, because the Burgundian army was probably not also from a strictly organizational, tactical point of view so hyper sophisticated and complicated as we think, right? When we have all the ordinances of the Burgundian army, and sometimes even properly the battle plans, we made a video about that in the past, that are a bit ideal, right? These were kind of games the aristocrats before the battle, the duke, the nobility made to say, how do we deploy troops? Then we know from the battle accounts that all these great ideal things on paper were were actually not even tried to be applicated. So we're sometimes, we're lucky to have such documents, but it's as if we attributed too much importance to them, and for this reason, kind of thinking that the Burgundian army was kind of, necessarily it would have had to had some, because of its development, its tactical, say the diversification, we could say like this, was something essentially different maybe from another army of other countries, let's say, at the point for them to having to lose, let's say, because there was something that had gotten wrong. The practice of warfare is much more, it's much simpler, right? Much more concrete. So we wish we knew what actually happened in these battles. I don't think by the 15th century are better documented, I don't know, than ones of the century before. Europe was becoming more humanistic, more elitistic, means that the authors, the chroniclers and so on, the historiographers, were ever more distant from the battlefields. So we don't understand necessarily more than much. So in a sense it will always remain a mystery what actually happened. It's just that the Swiss model is so different in itself that of course we can spot, however positively in it, decals for such outcome, right, in the advantages that the same Swiss army presented. Also because of the later success, the fact that the Swiss wanted to be hired by everybody. Later on, they made up essentially for French infantry during the Italian wars and so on, and they were copied. Look at the Landsknecht, the same Maximilian of Habsburg, and later on, basically every army in Europe. So it's we will go in detail to those things because we never have to fall into the progressistic and modernistic delusion that there was something that was created at some point that solved the problem, that was meant to succeed just because later on things moved from that outcome. That outcome could have been different, and even what happened later was the product of some other factors and contingencies. So even the same Swiss tactical decline, in a sense, was showing a limit of a confederacy born with those bases, their political and social bases and premises, right? So Switzerland could not be the same France, could not be the same Spain, right? So, but in fact, to each one its own. The military dimension always reflects the political and social one, and vice versa. We will keep talking about these things. For now, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.